All right. Good morning. Welcome to our St. Stephen's Sunday morning forum. This week is our last week in our series that we've started off the year on reimagining mission. And so we started off the year thinking about Jesus's social network. We looked at online and offline versions of church. Last week, we heard from Adam Atkinson about holistic mission. And this week is kind of very related to Adam's presentation last week. We have Jason Fout, who is a professor at Bexley-Seabury Seminary, and they are based in both Columbus, Ohio and Chicago, Illinois. And so Jason's joining us today from Ohio. Before he was a professor at Bexley-Seabury, he studied for his Ph.D. at the University of Cambridge. He also has seminary degrees from Seabury Western, which is now part of Bexley-Seabury Seminary Foundation. And so I am pleased to welcome Jason with us this morning. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks very much, Becky. Thank you very much for this invitation and the opportunity to talk about something that I really love and have just found amazing over the last 7 years or so. So I teach a course called Learning from London. It's a course, why don't I start sharing my slides just now and I can talk over that. It's a course which goes regularly to the Diocese of London in the Church of England. Just found amazing over the last 7 years or so. So I teach a course called Learning from London. It's a course, why don't I start sharing my slides just now and I can talk. Are you hearing that as well, Becky? It's a course which goes regularly to the Diocese of London in the Church of England. Just found amazing.
Sorry, I think I've got that echo stops. Go ahead.
If I'd known I was going to be on a 1-minute loop, I would have had some better material.
No, it had to do with the YouTube live stream, but we're good.
That's fine. That's fine. So it's been a strange year or so, hasn't it? Trying to figure out all this tech. I find I'm constantly swimming upstream with this. So I led my first travel course back in 2013. And I brought a group of about 6 students. We went to various parts of the Church of England because I had realized that I knew some people there doing some kind of interesting work in various different forms. And we, spent about 2.5 weeks really. And we were in Salisbury and Cambridge and then in London. But it was really at the end of that time, that several days we had in London, right at the end, that I realized, oh my gosh, there is some really amazing, innovative, lively, creative, flourishing forms of ministry in the Church of England in this diocese. And so I started doing some research on it, and I had realized that, and this is really the man bites dog headline. I had realized that since 1993, the Diocese of London had grown by 70%. At a time when virtually every other Church of England and indeed Anglican, whether it's Anglican Church of Canada, Episcopal Church, whatever, where virtually every other Anglican diocese in the developed world went through significant shrinkage. And in fact, the statistics for the Episcopal Church is that in any given decade in recent history, we've been losing roughly 24% of average Sunday attendance, which, it doesn't take an accountant to realize you can't sustain many more decades like that and still be a going concern. Now, of course, our concerns, I think, are larger than, just membership rolls or even giving, that sort of thing. We're really oriented or want to be oriented toward the kingdom, toward the good news of God in Christ and the transformation that brings in our lives and the world around us, and the way in which this fulfills us as humans, right? But I still think questions about numbers, questions about who we're connecting with, about the kind of good that's coming about, I think that these questions are important. I like the way that the Bishop of Liverpool puts it. He says, more disciples equals more justice. which is, again, one way of putting it and talking about the way that evangelism and discipleship really fit together. Evangelism, discipleship, and working for the common good as well. So I realized there had just been this amazing growth, and my natural question was, well, how? I mean, how is this happening at a time when so many of the rest of us are really having a hard time of it? So I spent a significant amount of time then over 2013 and 2014 looking into this, investigating it, writing up interviews time that I spent with leaders there, and put together a course on that basis. And we went in 2015 and 2016 in January, which I'll tell you, January in London can be a bit rugged. Although I guess if you're coming from someplace like Chicago, it's not quite so bad. But then we had enough demand that we expanded it to offering it twice a year. And so we'd go in January, and then we'd go in June again. That's when I met Becky. It was back in 2018 when she came with us on one of the summer courses. So I've been just really pleased to be able to offer this class. Whenever I go, it completely exhausts me, but I also come back with a new kind of energy and vision for what the church can be and what we could do. And it feels like having run a marathon, but also like coming back from a really great retreat. So, and I'm here this morning to share some of what I've learned from London about dynamic ministry, about evangelism, about just what we can learn in our own context from what I've seen there. So, without any further ado, I'll just this morning I have stories of all sorts of different churches, some of which Becky knows, some of which I've discovered on my own and haven't yet been part of the course. And they're not all the same. They all haven't grown sort of explosively. Some have, some haven't, but each of them are examples of really engaged, dynamic, faithful, turned on ministry. And I hope that they're going to be good examples for you to be able to help you fire your own imagination for what St. Stephen's might be called to in your particular context at this time. So without any further ado, let's turn to St. Luke's Church in Walthamstow. So St. Luke's Church it's a post-war church. Walthamstow is in the northeast part of London. And it had gone through some significant growth and thriving in the 1980s and 1990s with some charismatic revival. But by the early 2000s, that had really flagged. Membership, attendance was down. They weren't connecting with people. They were really struggling in a lot of ways and didn't necessarily have a vision for what they were about. And it was in 2007 that they got to a point, there was a meeting and it was raining out and the roof was dripping like a sieve and there were buckets all over the floor to collect the water. And this really kind of began their sense that actually we are very much called to something different. And what is that? And so they began a period of very intentional prayer, asking God, what is it in this time and at this place that we're called to do and who we're called to be? So this is, you see in the slide here on the left here, this is their old building. And you see here then on the map on the right where they were located. And they realized that they were tucked away back in this little residential neighborhood. But what they were really called to do was to sort of be out there and be public, to be connected with people and all the people who come through Walthamstow. And so you'll look further down on the map and you can see Walthamstow Central, and there's another transit node quite near there. And these are very heavily trafficked areas where people from all over London will come through. And then you'll see there's a red line that I've drawn in there. That's Walthamstow High Street, which High Street in British terms is like what we might say is Main Street. It's an area of really kind of intense retail presence where you'll find a lot of foot traffic up and down. But that's not all. This Walthamstow High Street also hosts a mile-long open-air market, which is present there 6 days a week. It's the longest single open-air market in Europe, as I understand it. But they didn't have a presence on Sunday, and so they thought that they would partner with a firm in London that does special markets for organic produce, for locally grown produce, organic, humanely grown meats, all these sorts of things, local crafts, etc. And so then they would host the market, serving as managers for it on Sunday, and moving from being tucked away back in their neighborhood to moving out to the high street so that they could be there actually where people were living their lives, to be able to connect with new people, to be able to connect with strangers, to be able to serve the local population in various ways. And so then they have I'll move to this next slide. They have a marquee, they have a stall that they run on the high street as a part of the market. So they'll come out early in the morning. The church, the members of the church will help various people to get set up, to get situated where they're going to be. They run in their booth a little cafe you can see here where they'll have coffee, hot drinks. They give hot drinks to the people who run the stalls for free. They'll have cake available. It's funny, they used to give away the cake for free, but then they started instead, what was it? Oh, they used to sell the cake, and then they decided, no, they're going to give it away for free with this, the possibility to make a donation for the work, and they ended up making more money giving it away for free, but simply soliciting a donation. It was really something. But then they used to use the tent as an opportunity to connect with people, to meet people, to talk about the work that they're doing. They'll offer to pray with people if they'd like to, but it's just an opportunity to meet people where they're at in their daily lives and in a way that they never would have possibly had a chance to if they were tucked away back in this sort of tumble down little building in a residential neighborhood. At the bottom slides, you see the pop-in cafe. This is actually moved, but what happened was they would come out on a Sunday morning to set up the farmers market, and they noticed that there were a number of people who were unhoused or who might not have, were sort of on the edges of society, who'd come along and would also help, but also it seemed pretty clear that they were hungry and they might ask then for a meal. And so they decided, well, okay, fine. What we'll do is we'll have them help us set up, but then we'll go and we'll meet. There's a public library just off the side of the park there, the square. They'll meet there and they'll pray. They'll pray for each other, whether it's the ministers or the folks who've helped set up. And that's the time to check in and for them to pray as well as to be prayed for, as well as to receive prayer. But then after that, they'll walk down to a cafe and they'll buy people breakfast, but then it's breakfast and Bible. And so there's a very simple Bible study that they'll do while they eat breakfast, seated in fours around the tables. And they try usually to have maybe two homeless, two members of the church on an individual table. So during this time, some of the members will be back at the stall taking care of things there. Other folks will be out having breakfast together with some of the folks who've come to help set up. So the farmers market is run Sunday 10 to 2. They also do other things. They'll have second breakfast, which is a breakfast meeting that the entire church will meet together for on the second Saturday of each month. They'll have Last Supper, which meets on the last Wednesday of each month, and it features supper. And then they have something that they call More Worship, which meets certain Wednesday evenings during the month. And so what they've been able to do is they left behind their facility. They're actually sold it on now. But the life of their church is in the Sunday farmers market, in these other events that they do, and so forth. It's really kind of out there, but it was what they felt quite strongly convinced that God was calling them to do, and they've been able to do some really significant work as a part of it. Now, it's also significant, I think, that they're also a part of a team ministry. There are 2 or 3 other churches that are a part of the cluster that they're together with. And in fact, the folks who are out there on a Sunday morning serving as a part of their worship will also worship together at St. Mary's Church, another church in the cluster, on Sunday evenings. So, but they find different ways of supporting their life together in Christ. So that's St. Luke's in the High Street. We could also look at St. Michael's in Camden Town. Now, St. Michael's is really quite a story. The church itself was started up in the 1880s. Historically, it's been very deeply Anglo-Catholic and remains that in its identity. But it had really gone downhill for quite some time until by the mid-1990s. There were never more than 12 people there on a Sunday. And in fact, the church was only open for 1 hour a week for people to come in on Sunday mornings for the Eucharist. And that, inevitably, that one door that was open wasn't the main door, it was a little door open at the back, the sort of thing that you really needed to know about in order to access it. In fact, the church looked derelict. I mean, it was falling apart. The churchyard was locked up with big chains, and most people in the neighborhood, if you ask them, would have told you that the church was abandoned and closed for quite some time ago. Thing is, they noticed at one point that there was a new Sainsbury's being built just down the road from them. Now, Sainsbury's is a large supermarket, and this church is very near a tube station as well. And it was figured that the Sainsbury's, the supermarket, would be bringing in about 55,000 people each week walking past from the tube station to the Sainsbury's. And in fact, it's a really vibrant neighborhood. It's been a neighborhood that's been revitalized, has a lot of new housing in it, is humming with life throughout the week. So enter then Father Nicholas Wheeler, who was vicar at the time. He said that, really, we need to take advantage of this. This is an opportunity for us. And so he came in. Together, they tidied up the inside of the church, make it, he tells stories about, there was a broken Stations of the Cross, which included a corpus of Christ on the cross, which had been sort of broken in several pieces and just tossed behind an altar to give an idea of the state it was in. They came in, though, and reordered the interior, tidied it up, restored it rather than reordering it, I guess I'd say, but then also really made a commitment to opening the church, including the main doors, and having it open as a resource for the neighborhood throughout the week. And so then, you see here then the gates, which were formerly locked, are now not only unlocked, unchained, but opened. The main door stands open during the week. There's a big welcoming sign. This church is open for you to come in. But they also have groups that meet there regularly through the week, whether it's an AA group, a small group Bible study. They'll have legal aid sessions that are available there for people in the neighborhood to come in, or all sorts of things like this. But then alongside this, this doorway is the churchyard, where there are benches and open space for people to come in and sit and just enjoy, to use that open space, which in London can really be quite at quite a premium. And in fact, the church has grown quite substantially as well, partly through this, partly just through a much more functional, healthy community. They now have over 100 people in church on a Sunday, but more than that, through partly because not everyone is able to get there on a Sunday, but also partly because there are daily services throughout the week and people who will come to Mass on, say, Tuesday, but can't come in on Sunday, maybe they're working, but are still a part of the congregation. The entire congregation now members something more like 300. And so again, it's been substantial growth, but partly through, or largely through, just restoring of what is there, noticing the opportunities that are there with that 55,000 people walking back and forth, and leveraging the real resources and gifts that they have there. I have another slide here to show you. Okay, so here we see just a little bit more where St. Michael's is situated. You see here where it is on the right-hand side with the map. You see that it's located just next to the Sainsbury's, and looking here on the sidewalk, you can see where it is situated relative to that. And you can also see again on the map on the right-hand side where it is relative to the Camden Town Tube Station. So they just noticed, look, there are people here. How can we connect with them? How can we use the opportunities that God is laying in our lap? So talking of that then, and thinking about green space as well, we could look at the Church of St. John at Hackney. So St. John at Hackney, you can see if we look at the map on the right-hand side, it's in a really densely settled part of kind of eastern London. And they realized that one of the gifts, let's see if I can move this here a little bit. They realized that one of the real gifts that they had to offer that would meet a need for the neighborhood was all that green space. They were situated within a very large bit of open green land, partly not entirely open because it was an ancient churchyard, a graveyard. But then as well, they had a lot of other green space that was attached to the church, which, it would be very easy simply to have gates around and have it completely unused. But that wouldn't actually be connecting with the neighborhood, meeting the needs that they had, and serving them and trying to connect with them for the sake of the gospel and the kingdom. So instead, what they did, they realized then that this neighborhood really needed green space, and so they did a comprehensive reordering of the green space. And you can see that over on the right-hand side of this slide. You see the St. John at Hackney Church right sort of in the center of it, and indeed a lot of it around the War Memorial and so forth on the upper part of it is still open and really quite fetching. But what they did is on the southern part of it, they cleared away the churchyard, the graves. I can't imagine all the administration that went into that. But what they did is they opened up an area where they now host a farmer's market on the weekends. The far south western part of the far southwestern part of the green space here is where they host that farmers market, and it's very near a railway station. So again, it's a transit node where you have people coming in and out all the time. It's an area that is very well used and very easy to connect with people. As I say, they host a farmers market there, but they've also cleared away space that's just open space now with some benches and sort of open space that people can use in various ways, just open green space. They have a community garden over in another area. And they also have an open but gated and safe children's play area as well. And alongside that, they have public lavatories and a refreshment stand, which is what you can see in the upper left-hand part of this slide, that little structure there. Again, all really needed by this neighborhood, and the space is well appreciated and well used. It was one way that they decided that they were really going to work to connect with the surrounding community. As well, they opened their large building to outside nonprofit groups to make connections then with other groups. And so, for example, they host the Hackney Children's Theatre. And in 3 years, they had 15 performances, which meant that there were roughly 5,000 people who were able to come over the threshold of St. John at Hackney Church to view a show. And they also began hosting other concerts and that sort of thing. And again, the whole idea was to indicate that, you know, this isn't some isolated, locked down, maybe slightly creepy place, or place you would only go if you were, you know, sort of one of those really strange people that I don't really know. But it just gave the church an opportunity to reach out, connect, and serve the neighborhood, but also other people to come in over the threshold and say, okay, yeah, this doesn't seem like such a strange place. So that later, if they had an alpha group, if they had, if you invited your neighbors in, they could say, yeah, I know that you guys are doing some good work. I actually was there for a show once. I'll give it a chance. They also hosted a job fair before the Olympics, which helped people in the neighborhood who didn't have employment to get connected in with good jobs as a part of that event. And all of this, all of these changes, all of these efforts also helped then with attendance, which over 7 years grew from 76 on a Sunday to about 180, which is growth of about 20% a year. And so it was both a matter of service, a matter of stewardship, a matter of reaching out and connecting, serving the common good, but also real growth in the church. And that's not all. There's a little bit more of the story I can tell about this, about St. John at Hackney. And it starts particularly in 2011. 2011, you might remember there were race riots in London that started in Tottenham, but then spread throughout the city and then later throughout the nation. Hard to believe that's almost 10 years ago now. Now, Rob Wickham was the vicar there. And at one point, he said that his BlackBerry, just to show the year that it was, but his BlackBerry started exploding with texts with people saying the riots are going to be spreading to Hackney. You know, get out now while you can. You know, get home and get locked down just for your own safety. And of course, Rob's now bishop of this area, by the way, but at the time he was vicar, and Rob's the sort of person who doesn't take well to that sort of warning. So what he did instead was he put on his cassock, he called up the bishop, who himself came out at the time, and they went out and stood on the streets and spent the time then trying to mediate between the police on the one hand and the protesters, not the protesters at that point, but the rioters on the other. And Rob says it was really amazing that it was almost like at one point it was almost like that time in Revelation where there's silence in heaven and on earth, because at one point an old woman who lived in the area was outside, but she fell over with she had been outside for some reason, fell over with a coronary, and so Rob and the bishop interceded with the rioters to ask them please to stop, clear away, so that they could get an ambulance in to take care of this woman. And they did. And he says that there was a half hour's silence there while they attended to this woman. And then, but then as soon as they took her away, sort of all hell broke loose again. It was really awkward. But he was able to be there, and he was able to do some of the subsequent things that he did because he had spent his ministry really building trust with people in the neighborhood, with people in his parish, people in the area. Not that long before, he had taken a funeral for a very popular young man who had been a rising, promising soccer star, but had been a victim of a knife attack. This was a really huge public funeral that some people hadn't wanted to touch, but he opened St. John at Hackney for just this purpose, and used that then as an opportunity to connect with all sorts of other people in the neighborhood and really, show care and concern for the real loss that had taken place and the trauma that the neighborhood was going through. So in the wake of the riots, though, the very next day, he organized a cleanup campaign via Twitter, calling people out. And the next morning they had 2,000 people with brooms and dustpans all assembled so that they could clean up in the wake of the riots. They gathered on the town hall steps, and he sort of led the group and led a couple of prayers, but also they began with 2 minutes of silence in all of that, trying to offer people an opportunity to have some agency, to take back their streets, which they felt probably quite scandalized about, that had been the source of, that had been in the news, that there had been such loss and predation at the time. So also in the neighborhood, there was a convenience store which should have been owned and operated for 11 years by a local resident named Siva Kendaya. That convenience store had been ransacked and burned. Now the building was covered by insurance, but Siva had all his savings invested in the stock, which wasn't covered by insurance. And so Rob and a team of local people created a Save the Shop fund, and they had appeals on television and the internet. And over the next month, they managed to raise £30,000 to help him restock his shop and get back on his feet. But then also, Rob worked with the manager of the local branch of Marks and Spencer. Hard to think of an analog of Marks and Spencer. It's a sort of a mid-level department store with a very large food hall as well, very well known, especially in the UK. But what they did is he got them to help sponsor afternoon tea for 400 people, and that's the picture over here on the right-hand side of the slide. A week after the streets had been choked with violence, the streets were again closed, but this time they had tables and chairs, tea and cakes, open-air music, hula hoops, and sidewalk chalk. And so this allowed, again, hundreds of people to reclaim their steps, reclaim their streets for their community, to reconnect instead of just being just hiding at home from the unsafety. Instead, this was an opportunity for them to be out. And Rob and John saw this very much as one way in which the gospel can be served and the common good served as well. We might then look at a different sort of a situation. This is St. Paul's in Shadwell. Now, the original church at Shadwell was built by Puritans in the mid-17th century. This structure, this is in London's East End, not far from where the docks used to be. This structure dates from the early 1800s. And over the centuries, it had gone through a lot of different changes. It started as a word-centered place of preaching, then an Anglo-Catholic congregation, and moved back again. It was always actually associated with the docks, and a lot of sea captains, 70 some, are actually buried in the churchyard there. And actually, the mother of President Thomas Jefferson was baptized there. So it's a very historic church. But by 2004, only about 15 people worshiped there. And in fact, the bishop was proposing that St. Paul's should be closed, or there might be another possibility. Now, the possibility might be that they could instead receive a transplant team. This isn't actually a new church plant. This is more a transplant, a group of people moving from one church to another. And so Holy Trinity Brompton proposed to transplant into St. Paul's Shadwell. And so what happened was HTB, Holy Trinity Brompton, realized that they had about 80 people who already lived in the area where in Shadwell, the area where this church was. And they proposed that those people consider being a part of a church planting team and join this new church. And then about 20 people at HTB to be a part of this transplant team proposed that they would move into Shadwell, this other neighborhood of London, in order to serve the transplant team. So there were 15 people there, 100 worshipers came. HTB also sent a new vicar, a parish administrator, a youth worker, and a small grant for expenses. They sent about £50,000, but that might be misleading, because actually The money was used up in about the first month when they realized what state the roof was in and how much work it needed to be workable. So they came in, as part of coming in, they reordered the church. They took out the pews and put in flexible seating instead. They brought in some new forms of worship. And the church was now being used also throughout the week. They would have study groups that would meet there. They'd have groups for carers with children. They would have, through the winter time, they'd be able to clear away the chairs in order to have a night shelter for people who were unhoused to be able to sleep during the winter time. And so, again, a church that was sort of Sunday only became a thriving source of life in a neighborhood which itself was increasingly being revitalized as well. So this is Rick Thorpe, who was the first vicar of, or the vicar who had been sent by Holy Trinity Brompton to St. Paul's Shadwell. He's now the bishop for church plants in the Church of England. But you can hopefully see it here. The picture is a bit dark, and I apologize about that. But this picture on the left-hand side is really something. This little nondescript table, it dates from 1685. So it's, a little quick math, well over 400 years old, 430 some years old. But I think it's really a good example of the perspective that St. Paul's Shadwell has taken to its ministry, and something for us to consider as well. The table is well old, but it's also worn and chipped from use. It doesn't actually have any special value as an antique. But here's the thing. Every service of communion that they have at St. Paul's, they bring that 400-plus-year-old table out into the nave. It's lovingly draped with a white cloth, and it serves as their communion table. It's honored as a sign of continuity with the past of this congregation, but at the same time, it's honored through being used rather than just being an item that's put on display or sort of in a display case somewhere. It's used by the congregation for its nourishment in the present as they're navigating their own changes. But its ultimate value might also be as it helps the congregation to build for and move into the future. And this really is Rick's attitude toward all of this. He insists, you need to honor the past, you need to navigate change in the present, you need to build for the future. That's absolutely it. You can't be stuck in the past. The change in the present isn't everything, doesn't clear away or navigate the very real gifts that the past gives us. And in all of this, we're building for the future. The other thing that St. Paul's is really well known for is that their vision for themselves, their self-identity is that they are a church plant that plants churches. So they started out with 115 with that first transplant in, but they grew over the first year or so to about 350 in church on a Sunday morning. But again, they've been very clear that we're a church that plants churches. And so in 15 years, they've actually gone on to plant 5 other churches. They're getting prepared to plant a 6th. At least they were before the pandemic. I haven't heard from them since then. I just haven't been in touch with them. But here's the thing. Those 5 other churches have themselves gone on to plant new churches. And again, Rick is really clear about this. In this task of planting, you need to send your best. You need to be absolutely committed to what you're doing, give away your best. And the whole idea here is that God has given us his best. And so that ought to be our attitude in everything we do as well, constantly giving away our best. I realize I'm at 40 past the hour, friends, so let me just quickly dip through my slides, talk just about some final observations, and then I'd be happy to have some question and answer. I know that you talked about St. Peter's Bethnal Green. St. Peter's Bethnal Green is one of those churches planted by St. Paul's Shadwell. You already know probably a fair amount about it, having spent some time with Adam. Here's the one thing I'd say. In this picture down at the very bottom, there's what they call a zebra crossing. That crossing over a street which where a pedestrian has right-of-way over the oncoming cars. And this is something that St. Peter's worked with the local council to have installed, because they realized previously this road had been what they call a rat run. It's a sort of a speedway from one major street to another that people used to cut through on. They drive really quickly, and this road then ends up being a really hard border that was very unsafe to try to get across. Families with children, old people, it didn't matter. If you had speeding cars, it was unsafe. And so they saw, as a part of their service to the neighborhood, to work again with the local council to have this installed, and then to reconnect the two parts of the neighborhood, because it's now much easier and safer to get from one part of the neighborhood to the other. So we could also talk about Holy Trinity Brompton and the work that they've done with church planting. We could also talk about the work that they've done with Alpha. Alpha is run across all sorts of different sites, but it began at Holy Trinity Brompton, and at any given time they have about 1,500 people involved in Alpha, just people coming out to explore the Christian faith and what it means. They run it in prisons. They have Alpha for youth. It's in 112 different languages in 169 countries. It began at Holy Trinity Brompton. It's been a real source of growth and life, not only for HTB, but for other churches and for the church throughout the world, with people coming into faith. Sometimes, though, people will ask, okay, fine, there's Alpha, but what about Beta? What about Gamma? Where are the other courses? You know, this is a really elementary introduction to the faith. Why don't you have more courses? Well, part of that's because it's ecumenical. And so, you know, once you get into really involved talk about the sacraments and so forth, it's better that that takes place with the particular local community. But then I think even more importantly than that is the idea that, fine, you know, if you've come to faith on Alpha, the idea is that you get involved with a small group, you get involved with a local church, but then also you get involved with your faith in your life. As is sometimes said, the meat is in the streets. In other words, the growth, the deepening of your faith, the maturing of your faith is in the streets. It's not in another course. If you come to faith, you're not coming into faith on something that has one course after another after another. The Christian life absolutely engages the intellect. There's a great deal that we can always be learning from it, but it also should be lifelong learning, as we're always reflecting on our life, our engagement with other people. We're trying to help other people, connect with them, serve them, and so forth. And so one of the reasons that they don't have a Beta course is that the meat is in the streets. And then if we had more time, we could also talk about St. Martin in the Fields, which is, I think, another example of really active, engaged, turned-on ministry. We'll leave that for another time. So here's some of what I've learned from London, though, and just as sort of reflecting on some of these stories. First of all, be willing to make sacrifices to connect to the world that we're called to, a world that God created and loves, for whom Jesus gave his life, and in which the Holy Spirit is actively working to bring healing, reconciliation, and salvation. And so then we need to rethink business as usual, like St. Luke's did, moving from their facility to something which was brand new and out of the box, but in a way that they were convinced that God was calling them to. But it also might mean that we need a renewed commitment to business as usual, rather like St. Michael's Camden town did. They renewed their facility and leveraged it to connect with people. So it's not just one thing or the other. So secondly, keep trying. Be willing to fail and to try again. Anything worth doing is worth doing badly. You can't wait until you know you've got it perfect. In fact, one of the things that Rick Thorpe says is that in their work in church planting, they haven't failed very much, which means that they haven't risked very much, and that maybe they need to keep working and trying even more new things to risk failing, because failure is one of the best opportunities we have for learning. So thirdly, be clear about who you are. Be clear about also what the gospel of Jesus Christ is. You might not express it exactly the same way that St. Michael's does, or St. Luke's did, or St. Luke's does, or that HTB does. That's fine. But be clear about who you are. Be clear about what God has done in Jesus, why it matters, why it's important, and why it's a great gift for you and for the world around you. Fourthly, never stop learning. Never think you've gotten there. One of the things I really love about HTB is the largest Church of England congregation in the world. They have 4,500 people in church across a dozen services on a Sunday. And they keep sending people out to plant other churches and to be in other places. But the thing is, they've never gotten to one point where they say, this is it. This is our formula. We're just going to keep doing this. They're constantly learning, adapting, changing in order to continue being faithful and connected to God and God's mission. Always be willing to work with surprising people, especially brothers and sisters in the faith, even when they're not your tribe. One of the great things I've seen in London is Catholics working with evangelicals, working with charismatics, working with broad church people, just across the gamut. They will differentiate themselves from each other, but they can also appreciate each other and learn from each other. Also, God gives freely, so give away your best. Be willing to. Start with what God has given you. Don't start with what you think that you don't have and need. So this is just a basic principle. God's given you some great things, and you can't look down the road. You can't look at the church over there and say, if we really had that, then we could do it. Actually, what has God given you, and what is God calling you to in your place at your time? The follow-up to a course, the follow-up to a commitment in faith isn't another course, because the meat is in the streets. Also, a new believer is a precious thing. Someone who's just come to faith, someone who maybe has just been recommitted to faith in a new way, this is a precious thing. This is someone who shouldn't be in a holding pattern for 10 years before they can be trusted with leadership or with doing something really significant. Trust them from the beginning, because partly they can connect with people who haven't been, like I have been, a member of the church for 30 some years, right? So this is a precious thing, and connect with them, respect them, empower them. Don't be so enchanted with tools you lose sight of the task. It's easy to come to see something that's really working in ministry in one place, and it's sort of like you go to Home Depot and you find a really nifty tool, and then you go back home and you're looking around for some way to use it, even though you're not exactly sure what it's for. Start with people and then go to tools. And then finally, be constantly engaged with Scripture, root everything in prayer, be connected with God. That is absolutely our sheet anchor in everything that we do. So there you go. Those are some of my observations from what I've seen in London. And I'd be interested in hearing from you all. I'll also just give the inevitable shameless plug. I've written a book on this called Learning from London, Church Growth in Unlikely Places. It's available. And pretty good read, I think. And Becky has a copy there. And then also I run a course called Learning from London. We're hoping, fingers crossed, to go back in 2022 in January and or June. Dates are TBD, as everything is TBD these days. Anyway, if I've taken groups from churches before, this is something St. Stephen's was interested in joining, a small group of 3 or 4 people joining a larger group. This is absolutely something we could consider. And if 2022 doesn't work, it will be offered constantly going forward. So anyway, looking at the time, I realize I've gone quite a bit over. I'm sorry about that, Becky.
No, it's okay. We're good. We still got a few minutes where we can take questions. And yes, I've got the copy of Learning from London. I still need to, I haven't read through all of it, but a lot of it seemed like familiar ideas that I'm happy to revisit. And who knows, maybe we can do a book discussion on this sometime here with St. Stephen's. And I would love to be a part of a group if we could ever get to a point where travel is possible again.
Absolutely.
But we can learn from London still, even if we can't go there right now.
That's right.
So no, I was, and I appreciated, Jason changes up the itinerary each time he takes a Learning from London course. And so actually, of the churches he shared, I think the only one of those I visited was HTB. Like, it was a totally different set of places that we went. Some people went to Walthamstow as a small group, but I was in the small group that went to St. Peter's, Bethnal Green. So, but I did hear about it. So yeah, there's so many good, creative, innovative things happening as far as connecting churches with the community there, that you can't fit them all on one week trip, even though we fit a lot on the, as I mentioned, I think last week to people, are long days learning from London, a lot of 12 to 14-hour days traversing the streets and tube lines of London. So it's amazing. You're not just in one part, you're seeing every corner of the diocese, and such a diversity of churches that they have too. I do see a question. We're going to take a YouTube question first. Melinda is asking about Alpha course. Is Alpha produced, filmed by one church and put online for everyone's use, or is it put together by several churches coming together? Maybe you could just briefly kind of clarify Alpha, maybe mention a place where they could find out more online if they're interested.
Sure, right, absolutely. So I'm not sure if it's a question about the curriculum or about how it's run.
I think she's wondering sort of who is the source. Maybe not everyone here is familiar with the Alpha small group curriculum.
So Alpha was begun it was begun in the 1990s in its present form. Started at HTB, but it's also its own separate, independent, and sort of worldwide thing now. So the interesting thing is that as it's kept evolving and kept going through changes, kept being updated, kept being improved, it's the sort of thing that they'll offer and then reflect on, offer and reflect on, constantly improving it. So here's the interesting thing. They, as they've kept working on it, they keep bringing in representatives of other denominations, other churches to work on it as well. And so now, actually, in America, you're very likely to find Alpha running in a Roman Catholic congregation as much as in a charismatic evangelical place or something, right? It's across a wide variety of denominations. It's an ecumenical, very intentionally an ecumenical ministry, which is intended to serve the breadth of the church. So yeah. So I think that's probably the best quick answer I can give if I've understood.
Right. Yeah. My experience with Alpha is my parish in Florida. They used it at some points. They ran it. So some Episcopal churches will use Alpha as a way of kind of either introducing people to the basics of the faith, or reviewing and refreshing as sort of a sense of renewing people's commitment to those, foundational parts of our faith.
So the interesting thing is
associated with maybe a more evangelical strand in the Episcopal Church, I guess. Would that be fair?
I think probably so, but they try very intentionally to have it be broader than that. And HTB and what they do, I mean, they have their own ethos and they're pretty clear about what they're doing, but they also try to be really clear that they're one part of what God is doing. They're not sort of everything, and Alpha is intended to be used on a broad basis. And in fact, I know one Episcopal diocese that's rolling out Alpha on a fairly broad basis. Actually, they have a canon and a couple of other people involved in it, and they're doing it online. And in fact, this has been the really big innovation in the last 12 months. Right. A lot of Alpha groups have moved online and have found, actually, at first they weren't sure how it was going to work, and they found actually that they're getting even more people into Alpha groups online than they would in person. Because instead of crossing over a threshold to a church, someone who's not exactly sure what they think about this, not sure if they want to be involved in it, they can show up to a Zoom meeting, and they can always click off if they don't want to be there. Right. So going forward,
safe entry point
will be one component of Alpha.
Mm-hmm.
So and if you want to learn more, Alpha has a website with all sorts of details there, and it's all free.
Right. And we had the chance to visit with people who are on staff with Alpha, and to kind of HTB, Holy Trinity Brompton, which Jason talked about briefly at the end. If you're not familiar, Google that or use your favorite search engine for that. It's quite the operation. Nikki Gumbel, is he still the vicar
Yes.
of HTB? Is also the person behind Alpha, and so and all of the church planting work that he was telling us about with St. Paul Shadwell is but one of many church plants from Holy Trinity Brompton, and then St. Paul Shadwell has their church plants that include St. Peter's Bethnal Green, and then I think St. Peter's planted at least one. So it's interesting, sort of that idea of church growth and that commitment to planting out other congregations. I liked that idea that you shared from Bishop Thorpe, giving away our best. It made me think too of, St. Francis at the Engine Room, where I spent some time after learning from London to kind of continue. They were started as a partnership, as I understand it, with London City Mission, which is a interdenominational parachurch, I guess it would be an organization, I think would be fair to say, that does work throughout London, that we visited with them. But one of the people who was associated with St. Francis at the Engine Room, Andrew Kwapong, right? He's, I think, during his seminary formation, and at the time we were there, he was just leaving St. Francis at the Engine Room in Tottenham, and they had sort of pointed him toward, they wanted him to go to the Grenfell Tower area. There had been a major public housing towers there that had a horrible fire. And it was just a really devastating moment in London. And so London City Mission, I was just trying to remind myself, the name of the church is partnering with a congregation called St. Helens. And that's where Andrew and Maria Kwapong and their family moved to that part of London. And I kind of think of that as a great example of giving away your best, because Andrew Kwapong is such a dynamic person and was a major part of the work that was done at Tottenham Hale in the years following the race riots there and the establishment of St. Francis at the Engine Room. And then they see like there's a need somewhere else. And we think that Andrew and Maria would be great resources in that community. And so that's what came to mind as one of many examples of kind of giving away our best, not keeping our resources to ourselves, but how can we share them for the greater good?
Absolutely.
I see a question here as we finish up in this last minute or two together. Michael is wondering about how the examples don't necessarily seem especially particular to London, aside from like, location relative to underground stations. But are these kind of dynamic ministries happening elsewhere in the UK?
Some of them are, yeah. And some individual congregations are growing. If I had more time, I could talk more about how this has also been empowered and incentivized from the diocesan level as well. So part of it is that there is a sort of an overall ecology that was established, especially by Bishop Richard Charters when he was Bishop of London, and is really, I think, continued by Bishop Sarah now that she's Bishop of London as well. That really encourages and incentivizes mission in this way, in all sorts of different ways. And as the bishops are really clear that, even though they represent different traditions themselves, they're there to support the mission of all sorts of different churches. And there was an expectation that each church has to have a mission action plan, which was, for this year, these are the things that we're going to do. Here are our longer term goals. Here's who is responsible for that. Really concrete thinking about how they're going to serve their not only their congregation, but the neighborhood. And then there was also they have 7-year rolling vision statements for the diocese. And the most recent one was Capital Vision 2020, which included things like in 7 years, they were going to start or renew 100 worshiping communities, which, some of these are church plants, some of them are brand new services, some of them are missional communities. but essentially new sorts of church services, new forms of church in new ways to meet new people, to connect with new people. And 107 years is more than one a month. So this is part of it too, was just their commitment of resources and time and energy, money to this, and using the resources they've had. In various ways, they've been trying to connect with and spread that through the rest of the Church of England. Of course, in the last year with the pandemic, there are a lot of difficulties and difficult decisions and cuts being faced and so forth. So that's one difference. It's not quite uniform, partly because it's been incentivized from the center, as well as being allowed on the edges as well in London.
Right. Well, we have reached the end of our time, and someone else was also asking about innovative congregations in the U.S. That is a question for another day. Maybe we'll do a session on that in our Sunday forum sometime in the
future. I'll look forward to coming back in a year and hearing how St. Stephen's is one of those churches doing really innovative stuff.
Yeah, we have some pretty cool things going on here. We have an apiary, we do holy hikes, we open up our wooded area of our property to, people doing walks and runs through the neighborhood. So we're positioned to kind of continue to kind of think creatively here about how we connect with our community at St. Stephen's as well. So yes, I look forward to having that conversation too about what have we learned in the future. Well, thank you, Jason, so much for joining us today. It was lovely to see you again. I hope that learning from London can happen again in the near future, if not in 2021, then 2022. And hopefully, maybe, who knows, maybe some people from St. Stephen's would discern that they are supposed to do that as a part of our journey here as well. So we will go ahead, and I would invite people that if you're looking to join us for worship, our live stream from the nave with music will begin at 10:15 here. If you're with us on YouTube, if you're with us on Zoom, you can migrate your way over to Facebook Live or YouTube, and you can find the service there beginning at 10:15. And this conversation will be archived along with all of our other